At this time, I'd like to ask Scott Fancher, who is going to introduce our speaker and tell you about a few things that are fairly late updates. Scott.
Thank you, Phil. Welcome, everybody. My pleasure to be here. Always an honor to represent the Mountain Meadows Monument Foundation. I'm going to introduce our speaker, but before I do, this past August, the Mountain Meadows Monument Foundation became the title landowner of the old Carrollton Lodge, and we're extremely excited about the possibilities that presents for us to continue to preserve the history and the traditions. So if you get a chance and you're out near Carrollton, Arkansas, please go by and look at our scale replica of Major Carleton's cairn. And I think we can all look forward to us increasing and adding to our interpretive history center there. So I think that deserves a round of applause. It's a big deal for me. My real chore or challenge tonight is to introduce our keynote speaker, Everett Bassett. Everett is a senior archaeologist of Transcon Environmental. He has 30 years experience as a historical archaeologist working in the Great Basin in southern Utah. He has conducted field work in Egypt, the Sudan, Great Britain, Australia, and throughout North America. In 1997, he was awarded the Secretary of Interior's Annual Award in Historic Preservation for his work in historic mine landscapes. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Everett Bassett.
Thank you, Scott. I'm honored to be asked to speak in front of this community of descendants and their friends and their supporters. Tonight I'm going to talk about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. It may not be a surprise to you. Our discussion tonight is going to be a little different, though. I'm not going to mention who did what to whom or what their motives might have been. Instead, I'm just going to talk about landscape. What's out there? What isn't out there? Do we have it right? Is there anything out there to be preserved? And I know the landscape out there is very special to a lot of you. The places, the killing fields, the mass graves are what define many of you and have defined you for a very long time. So it's necessary that we get it right. Now, I became interested in this issue just last summer. As Scott mentioned, I have worked in this area a long time. I have read all of the historic documents associated with the Mountain Meadows Massacre, but I've never considered myself an expert on it. And last summer, I went out in the field and I noticed where the new monuments had been placed. Lovely monuments, many of you have seen them. Beautiful giant granite monoliths, carved in stone, saying absolutely definitely, this is where the men and the boys were killed, and this is where their remains lie. And then further up the road, this is where the women and the children were killed, and this is where their remains lie. But the locations puzzled me. They didn't seem quite right. They didn't correspond to what I knew about the historic record. And they didn't make a lot of sense in terms of how people in that period used the landscape. Now, I've spent a good part of my life tramping around those hills, talking to farmers and ranchers and miners. And I kind of got a feel for where things should be and where they shouldn't. So I decided to understand what was going on, I needed to go back and check for myself. Because the important thing here is when you are absolutely sure you know where something is, it also means the flip side, you know where it isn't. And if you're wrong, those places where you know it isn't are no longer protected. That was my concern. If it had been gotten wrong, then these sites remained unprotected. Oh, thank you, Shannon. So, I really want to share with you the landscape itself. So we're going to be using Google Earth, and it can get a little bit fiddly. So I hope you'll bear with me. So we're talking about landscape. And when I went out into the field, I determined pretty quickly that I would not be able to find the massacre sites, the killing fields. The reason being is the events that happened there occurred only over a matter of minutes. And once the bodies were removed, there was nothing left to find. I also decided it would be fool's errand to try to find the graves. The meadows is heavily disturbed today. There are scatters and piles of rocks everywhere. And knowing which one may or may not be a grave, which we really don't know what these graves look like, would be impossible. But it did occur to me that we would, if I found the road they walked on, then I would narrow the search field down. I might be able to find the graves. I thought maybe the graves were gone, but I could look for them. And if I was able to find the graves, I would also know exactly where the massacres took place within a matter of feet. And I'm happy to say all those things came true. I found the road, I found the graves, and I found the massacre sites. And these graves are huge. They're gigantic, 40 feet across, 5 feet high. So we'll get to that because I know you're really excited to see that. But I want you to understand the logic and the methodology I used. 2 reasons. One is, I think it might be fun for you to see how archaeologists work. The second thing is, I need you to be able to look at what I've done and not just accept my conclusions, but be able to say, oh yeah, I understand why he's saying he found what he did, and I can trust it. Or, we need to do more research. We need to figure out maybe, is this not right? Okay, so what I'm going to start to talk about is the road, because this all comes down to the road. And you're probably going to hear a lot more about roads tonight than you ever wanted to know. But the granddaddy of roads out there, of course, is the Old Spanish Trail. And this was not so much, don't think of it as a road or even a trail, but rather a corridor, a drover's corridor. Starting in the late 1820s, people from the New Mexico Hispanic communities would drive donkeys with woolen goods to Southern California and come back with herds of hundreds of cattle and horses. And of course, along the way, they had to feed the livestock, which means that you have to run the livestock down the middle of the mountain valleys where the forage is most lush and, unfortunately, where the ground is softest. And what happens is these animals start wearing down the road. And what you typically see, and I'll show you examples here in a little bit, is you have a depression in the middle of the valley, and it gets deeper and deeper, and then they move up a little bit further in the valley. Okay, the ground's better, but the forage is worse. Then that goes down. Then they move further up, and then further up. There are locations, including just south of the Hamlin's Shanty, where I can show you there are 5 or 6 manifestations of the Old Spanish Trail right next to each other, each one replacing the one further downhill. So this is Mountain Meadows, and this is where the Old Spanish Trail comes through. Can you all see that? Okay. As you see, it comes right down the middle of the meadows. Now what happened was, through time, the area to the north, coming out of the meadows through Holt Canyon, got so eroded it couldn't be used anymore. Particularly, it couldn't be used by wagons. Also, at the south, going down through Mogatsu Canyon, and also going by the immigrant camp where the attack took place. So by the 1850s, the Old Spanish Trail, which went right by the spring, could no longer be used. Now, in the 1840s or the early 1850s, a new road was built. And this is called the California Trail. And let me go in here. And you can see what happens is it runs down the old Pinto Road approximately. At some point, it hops over to this portion of the Old Spanish Trail, which was still in good condition. It traveled down the Old Spanish Trail to right about where the highway is, and the highway is running right here. And there we lose it. Okay? Now we know down at this end, it jumps up over the mountain, heads down to the Santa Clara River. And this is the route that your descendants would have taken, your ancestors would have taken, had they lived. But of course, they didn't. So the question is, how did they get from this point approximately to this point approximately? Now, a lot of different people have different ideas. The National Landmark nomination suggests that it ran over here. And I think you can see it through here. Let me get rid of that. So they have it running up in here. And I have a few problems with that. One is that while it does follow a very good old road trace down in through here, where it runs by the new monument for the men and boys, when it gets to the highway, it stops. Well, that suggests to me that road was built after the state highway, which was in the 1920s or 1930s. Now from there, it follows in an exactly straight line the old highway up along here. Now, many of you, I'm sure, have been involved in road construction, and you know that when you're building a road where it's roller coaster road, you need heavy equipment, you need culverts. This is not an 1850s road. They couldn't have built it there, and they couldn't have built it straight. So that made me a little suspicious. So, from there, what I did was I went out and took a lot of pictures. This is actually an example. This isn't actually in Mountain Meadows, but this is an example of, you can see how the old road went along here, and then it moved up the hill through time, and those ruts are still present. Here you can see what happens through time. The water runs in the road, starts down-cutting the road, and you get a big ravine. And this is exactly what happened in Mountain Meadows. And this is the Old Spanish Trail at the location between the two graves I found. As you can see, it's kind of straight, doesn't meander, but it's been run down. Now, if you just go a couple feet from here, you'll see this. And this is actually an intact portion of the Old Spanish Trail. So this is how we know this ravine, which is, everybody talks about this ravine. John Lee talks about it. The military talks about it. The massacres and the graves were next to a ravine. The road ran near a ravine. And this ravine is what we now call the upper stretch of Mogatsu Creek. It's actually the old Spanish Trail. So we have a double whammy here. We have the two most famous historic properties in southern Utah, the old Spanish Trail and the Mountain Meadows massacre sites and graves right on top of each other. Very special place. So, what I did next was I tried to figure out where the road actually was. And this is, I hope you stick with me on this, because this is actually where we understand where things actually happened. So, we know, we have some evidence. Daniel McFarland, who was one of the militia members, who provided about the best accounts of what happened, very lucid. He said that the immigrants were led from the spring half a mile to the northeast to where the militia was waiting for them. So here's the immigrant spring, and we know where the ditch was. It was right at the northeast corner of the current monument. Anyway, Daniel McFarland said that the militia was waiting half a mile away to the northeast. And when you measure out that distance to the road, you come upon a very distinct saddle along the old California Trail. And what's interesting about this location, which I'll be able to show you in a moment, is that this allowed them to be on the road, but they're actually hidden from the spring by the mountain. But they're near their old spring and their encampment. So it's very likely that the immigrants did not know where the militia was or how big it was until they came around the corner and saw them waiting for them. Now, I don't know if this made them happy or upset, but it was really obvious that this location where the militia was mustering was one that was hidden from them. We kind of know where the road would have gone. And what I did next was identify the areas where the road could not have gone, because that narrows it down. There are several large hills, and there are a couple of really big ravines in the area. And these prevent places where they could go. So let's go back to this, and I think you'll see what I mean. If we measure from this point, and you want to look up here, it'll tell you when you get to half a mile. To right here. So that's right, as you can see, it's right in this saddle. And this saddle is where the militia was waiting. And it was right next to where their encampment was. So here's their encampment up at Abe Spring. Here's where they were waiting in this little saddle where they couldn't be seen. And then we know from Daniel McFarland that the road went north from there. Well, we have two hills, and we have some ravines. Big hill here, little hill here, ravines. They need to get from here to here, headed approximately straight north, avoiding these things. So that kind of narrows it down. So what I did was I went out in these fields, many of which are irrigated, but some of which are open pasture, and I looked for very old evidence of road traces that could date back to the 1850s. And I found 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I think you can see them here. There's a great one here, little one there, a really good one here, another one, and then a little bit right there. So from this point, it's connected the dots. And now I have a road that may not be exactly the route that was taken, but it's probably close to it. At least this was my first guess. Okay, now we can take this information of where the road is and we can tie in the historic data. And this is how this all comes together. And the very best data comes from Brevet Major Carleton. Here he is, very imposing looking guy. He was no dummy. He was not a cartographer, but as a major in the Dragoons, he had been seconded to the U.S. Topographic Engineers during the Pawnee expedition. So he spent a good part of his life helping engineers. Now he would have had with him some instruments. This is a Burke's solar compass. And this is a Gunter's chains. With these instruments, he could have measured things to within a couple of feet over several miles. Okay, so we're not talking, when he said, oh, we measured it, he very specifically uses language. I had measured the distance between the spring and the massacre site, and it was this distance. So I think of all the information we have from the victims, from the militia, this official record of the U.S. government is probably the best. Okay, so what I like to do is measure that distance and show you how I measured out along the road. So we'll get rid of these. We think we know where the road is now, so we're not going to worry about the old Spanish trail anymore. We're just going to look at this new road that I've identified as possibly being our road. And so Major Brevet Carleton said he had measured point to point, in other words, a straight line, 6,975 feet. And that's he actually said it was 1 mile, 565 yards, so I translated it. And what we'll see here in a moment was I measured out that distance following along the road, the new road, till I got to that distance. And then I stopped. And then we have from Brewer's records, Dr. Brewer, who built the graves, that the graves were in a oak scrub filled ravine 50 yards to the west of the road. So this is very precise information. And if I actually have the road, then maybe we could figure out where these graves used to be. So I walked out there, I took measures, I used a theodolite, I tried to replicate the type of equipment that Major Brevet used, and to go to the exact location where he said, the men and boys, your ancestors, were killed. I don't think this has ever been done before, and I'm not sure why. So, we're going to take a measurement again, and we're going to do it in feet. And let's see, what did I say? I said 6,975. So I'm going to need your help on this, because this is a little tricky. We're going to start again from the immigrants' camp, and we're going to follow along the road as best we can. till we find a point on the road that is 697 feet from the spring. Let's see. What did I say, 695? 697, okay. You guys aren't going to cut me any slack, are you? No, that's close enough. Okay, I'm going to save that, and we're going to go in, and we're going to look at it, and what we see is, fortunately, as you can see by the bright green line, that we're actually on a portion of a road trace that is still there. And I'm going to stick a pin in this so we know where it is. It is right here where we measure to. Right there. Okay. This is the point where the men and boys were massacred, according to the U.S. government. Okay. Then, now we remember Dr. Brewer. Let's go ahead and look at the road and see if we can actually see it here. Here we go. Can you see it?
Yes.
It's right there. It's not this. This is a modern two-track. It's right here, and it comes down along here. And along here, for example, you can see how straight this section, well, that's not a natural creek. That is the Old Spanish Trail. And it's all washed out, and so we're going along the edge of it now to avoid that. Okay.
Dr. Bassett, going north, are you going uphill or downhill?
We're going uphill.
Okay.
And I'll show you a profile in a little bit, but it's a very mild slope. Dr. Brewer said that it was 150 feet out, or 50 yards. So if we go from there, and we go directly perpendicular for 150 feet, let's see, that's close enough. We come to the edge of a ravine. The ravine is filled with scrub oak, like he described. And I came out here, and I noticed in the bottom of the ravine there was a huge pile of rubble, rocks, and things. But I look around, I sit down on the pile of rocks, and I kind of scratch my head. I look around, I don't see any graves. I don't see any evidence of graves. I don't see any cairns. I don't see any scattered rock on the surface. And so I get up and I walk away. And then I turn around and I look back, because there's something not quite right about this pile of rocks. It just didn't look right. And there weren't any other piles of rocks that I had seen in the region. So I decided to investigate it a little bit more. But another thing that Dr. Brewer said was that the women's grave was 350 meters, 350 yards to the north. Well, let's look there and see if there's anything there. Okay, so here we go. $350. Yeah, it's right about there. And so when I went up there, I discovered right here an identical pile of rocks. But not just a pile of rocks. These are very special, and we'll get to those in a moment. So everything fits out exactly, almost. Brewer also said that the killing fields and the graves were 15 degrees west of north from the spring. So that would be 345 degrees in today's lingo. Let's put these roads back. So let's go back to the spring and measure that out. Okay, here's the spring. And instead of looking at distance, we're going to look at direction. I don't know if you can see it here, but the direction right here will tell you the direction. And it's hard for you to see, so I'll tell you where 345 degrees is. It's up there. It's up in the mountains. Now this was a huge problem. Shurtleff and Ertl fought over this. They couldn't, these were two big researchers who've done a lot of wonderful research on Mountain Meadows back in the 50s and the 60s, because Ertl knew a lot about mapping, and he said there is no way that Dr. Brewer got this wrong. And he actually thought there was an old road running up in this area that was followed. I agree with him. I don't think Brewer got it wrong. But what happened is when I was up at this location right here, which is where I thought the men's graves were, I turned around and I looked back, and I realized that from this point, you cannot see the Emigrant Spring. The hills are in the way. But you can see, just a moment. You can see Abe Spring. Okay? So it occurred to me that maybe instead of measuring from the Emigrant Spring, they measured from what then was the most prominent landmark in the Mountain Meadows. So let's try that. Okay, we'll take the measurements and we'll go from Abe Spring. And when we do that, we get 345 degrees exactly. So, I'm thinking what happened was Major Carleton measured the distance from the Emigrant Spring by having his surveyors go like this. And when Brewer was building his graves, he had somebody backshoot to the spring. And in the final report, these two measurements got conflated, and it's become assumed that these were both down here. So I think that helps support that conundrum. Let's look at the graves. This is the location of the women's and the girls' graves. I'm sorry. This is the location of the men's and the boys' graves. And it's about 40 feet across, and it's on the edge of the wash. And there's a couple things here that are kind of interesting. One is that the wash has gone around it. It's been there so long, it's rerouted the ravine. The other thing is this slab here, which I believe is a tablet, and we'll come back to that. I don't want to tease you here, but I'm going to move ahead, and we'll come back and look at these graves in a little bit. This is the grave of the women and the children. They're both rectangular. They're a little hard to see from this angle. Very large, both in the edge of the ravine. Now, since we know where the graves are, we also know, if we're correct, we also know where the killing took place. Now, here I'm looking west, and the men and boys' grave is right in here that I just showed you. Along here, you can see the old trace. So, obviously the massacre didn't take place at one location, because there were probably 30 men and boys that were still alive and able to walk. And I assume that they were walking in close quarters. Each had a Mormon militiaman on his eastern side. Many of these were young boys or men who really didn't want to do what they had been asked to do. And I imagine the militia leaders wanted them all together. Now, after the killing, one of the militia members came back and they said that the bodies were lying approximately a rod apart. Well, that's 16 feet. That seems kind of far apart to me. I had thought maybe 4 or 6 feet. But either way, if we go with a rod apart, the men were stretched along this distance. And if we go with my shorter 4 to 6 feet, they were along this section right in here. This is looking at the killing fields from the other side. So here is the grave. Here's that juniper tree you saw before. Here is where the old road went. And right in here is where the men and boys were struck down. Where their bodies laid, at some point in the future, we don't know how long, was it days, weeks, months? Lots of conflicting reports. Most of these bodies were either thrown or carefully, partially buried in this ravine. And again, probably stretching along, they probably moved remains to the ravine. When the army came, they collected them along this stretch and they buried them at this location. This tree is very interesting. It is 65 inches in circumference. It's a very old tree, probably 400 or 500 years old. This tree would have been a mature tree when the massacre took place. This could have been the marker where they were told to attack. The soldiers who built the grave may have rusted under in the shade. But it's a very old tree, it's a very nice tree, and it really marks the center of this special place. Okay, let's look at the location where the women and children were supposedly attacked. It's not quite so clear as the men's, but we have a couple of different possibilities. We have a couple historic bits. One is that one of the militiamen said that there wasn't a ravine adjacent to the road where they were killed, but there was one within 100 yards. And so, and that's where the bodies were placed. So we know that there's a ravine about 100 yards away. We also have records from Major Carleton, from Brewer, and other people about how far it was from various different locations. Yeah, thank you. And when we put those all together, they cluster very nicely. So this is where the men and boys were. This is where the women's and children's grave is, I am suggesting. And when we look at these other things, what we find is that this is where Carleton said the attack occurred. This is where Brewer said it occurred. He was measuring from the immigrant spring. Let's come in a little closer here. This is where Brewer said it was when he measured it from the men's grave. Now remember, the men's grave is a whole lot closer. So I'm thinking that perhaps this is the most accurate measurement. And then we have the distance from the ravine where the bodies were thrown. And that is right there. So they're all within a couple 100 feet of each other. Unfortunately, as you notice, they're also right in the middle of Highway 18, which is unfortunate. Now, there's something else that's interesting about this location. I don't know if you can see it, but it's these light green trees here. They're very rare along the road here. and they're Utah serviceberry trees, and there's oak scrub, and the sagebrush here is huge, much more so than anywhere else. Now, if you recall in the accounts, all the survivors said, and a lot of the militia said, they were ambushed when the road went through an area of high sagebrush, of oak scrub, of heavy vegetation. In fact, one of the victims, she actually called it sedge bush. Now, I didn't know what sedge bush was. It's an archaic term, but it's used in the Bible. And in Job 8:11, it says, "Can the rush be green without moisture, or the sagebrush grow without water?" Sagebush is marsh vegetation. And so I was wondering why, out of the entire area, there is still serviceberry growing here. I went in and I put in a series of test augers, like in here, and then I compared them to ones out here. This is the location of an old seep. This was a boggy area in 1850s. It's still an area that gets a lot more moisture, and so you have these plants growing. And when I actually measured the wetland, it's right here. So this was a boggy area with lots of vegetation. This is where whoever attacked the women and children were hiding. Now, I have some pictures here of this. Okay, this is what it looks like today. This is how thick the vegetation is. A lot drier today. I imagine in the past, in the 1850s, this was much, much more lush. This is actually the old Spanish Trail and the California Trail. They come together here. This is where your ancestors were walking. This is where the women and children were attacked, I believe. And this is actually the highway right-of-way fence. So what we're looking at is actually a section of the Old Spanish Trail and the California Trail and the massacre site, all within State Highway 18 right-of-way. So tens of thousands of people drive by this every year. Okay, an interesting little side story here is the plant that grows here. It's serviceberry. And I don't know if any of you know about serviceberry. Here in the Ozarks and in the Appalachians where I used to live, they call it sarvisberry. And it was called that because it bloomed very, very early in the spring when the roads dried up enough for the Methodist circuit riders and the Presbyterian preachers to come out and give funeral services for the people who had died over the winter. Sarvisberry, for these people, your ancestors, was a symbol of sorrow and remembrance. So I think it's interesting that it survives and perseveres at this location. Okay, let's look at the graves themselves. These things are big, they're a little complicated, they're very hard to photograph. If you look at them from almost any angle, they look like piles of rocks. So I developed a method of pole aerial photography. And what I'm doing here is I'm holding on to a 45-foot tall pole with a camera with an automatic shutter on it. And most of these photos are taken looking straight down. You can see, this is the men's and boys. This is along the edge of the Weish, where the Weish is eroding it away. And you can see how fragile this is. You know, a rambunctious teenager walking on this could collapse the whole thing. And in fact, in the few months since I found it, 6 rocks have fallen down. So this thing is falling down pretty quickly. Here you can see the women's, and what's really interesting here is here's the highway, and here's the highway fence. So when I was recording this, you know, trucks were going by and honking at me. This is right on the highway. Here's the men's and boys. And a couple things. The wash goes around it. We have this thing. We have a lot of livestock trails coming down along the side of it. Now, it's a little hard to see here, but this area up here is actually the rectangular grave site. And I'm not calling it so much a grave because I think the remains may actually not be buried here, but are actually interned within these structures. So it may be that these aren't rocks on top of a grave, but in fact are structures with remains inside of them. And I'll show you more evidence of that. So here is looking straight down on the women's and children's. And you can see how rectangular it is from this angle. This is almost impossible to see unless you're flying over it. The other interesting thing are the dimensions. They're exactly 4 feet. 4 foot deep, 8 foot wide, 12 feet long. The men's and boys are the same as well. Also notice that there's big rocks around the edge. What this is a box, 4 foot high probably, a wall made of large boulders, probably with the remains placed in it, and then filled in and mounded over with rocks. Here's another, you can see another view of it. You can see these walls. Now this corner has collapsed into the wash. So these things are degrading. Here you can see a close-up. You can see the larger outer walls, and you can see the rubble in the middle. Very carefully selected rocks. The rocks are almost exactly the same size. This has not been dumped here. Here you can see how the walls along the side have been built. Now, soil has been washing down, but these are straight walls up and down. I believe they were originally 4 feet high. So these are big structures. You also notice a lot of soil coming down here. This is from pocket gophers. Here's the men and boys with me measuring it, and you can see how straight it is. Here's the men and boys again. You can see what we have here is we have the rectangular grave up here, which isn't quite easy to see from this angle. But on 3 sides, this side, and this side, were built large aprons of riprap that came down about 12 feet and protected the grave above from the wash. And as you can see, this entire apron has collapsed into the wash. We can be thankful they did that. If that apron had not been there, had not sacrificed itself, that entire pediment would be gone and the graves with them. Now here you can see how they constructed the edge of the apron. This is an arched wall. Here you can see how deep into this thing goes. And then the rectangular portion runs over here. So this is one side of the apron. The other side went down here. All of this is collapsed. And as I said, about 6 of these rocks have collapsed within the last few months. We're expecting a big El Nino this year, so we should be aware of that. These are some of the rocks that are in one of the graves. A couple points here. Big lichens. This is very old. These things grow very slowly. The second thing is, if you were to walk across a field out there, most of the rocks you would see was sandstone. No sandstone, not a single piece of sandstone is out there. It's all basalt and granite. Crappy sandstone was not allowed to be put into these graves, even though it would have made them a lot easier to build. Then this is interesting. This is a prehistoric artifact they use. It's a matadi blanket. It used to come down here. They were chipping the edges off to make a grinding stone. It cracked. Some Indians threw it away about 8,000 years ago. It got picked up and included here. Okay, this little guy is a Boda's pocket gopher. There's a bunch of them living on the men and boys underneath, and they're digging a lot of holes around the edge. And probably the reason they're there is because they like living rocks. So this is the slab. It's very interesting. It's 15 inches by 15 inches, and it's 5 inches thick. And I looked around for days. I could not find any rock, this is sandstone, this shape or size. This was specifically brought here to the men's grave and placed in a prominent position, angled out, and I believe that it probably had writing on it. Typically, they would have used axle grease, possibly paint, but I see this quite a lot in the West. Now, we can't read anything on it now, and maybe never was anything ever written. Maybe someone had an idea, one of the soldiers, and they didn't carry through it. It's possible chemical analysis could tell us what that tablet said. There should be residue if it was used. Okay, now these structures are interesting, and I was wondering where the idea to make them this way came from. And I think what it is, it's a development out of New England in what's called the double wall construction. Back in the 1830s to the 1850s was the golden age of rock wall building in the glacial areas of New England. And this is typically how they would build a wall. They would put rocks up, big rocks, and then they would fill the inside in with small bits of rubble. Sometimes this method was used to mark graves in New England. So here we have a rectangle filled with rubble. This is a mass grave. I think it dates from World War II in Greece. And there are bodies buried under here. But you can see the logic of this. It's a time of war. They're trying to get this done quickly. Only a couple people can dig a big hole at a time. But if like every villager grabbed 100 rocks, you could build this thing in a day. And the military built 3 of these. They built 3 of these in one day, 207 men. So it's an easy and fast way. And the military knew how to make these. In fact, there's another one that was in Mountain Meadows. This is the remains of the monument that replaced Carleton's monument. Built in 1864 by Captain George Price. And he described it as a 12-foot by 12-foot by 4-foot high wall filled in with mounded rubble. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The only difference being it was square rather than rectangular. This is something the Army did. And I think it's really useful that we're bringing the military back into this story. These graves were built according to military protocol by the military under orders from the military to bury Army veterans and their families. So the military has a say in this. This is an interesting issue. Okay, now the existing monument that is there was based, as best I understand it, is there was folklore in the region about piles of rubble that had been told to them by their parents and grandparents that this is where these people were buried. And I don't think that's correct. Also at the Men and Boys Monument is this rock with a cross on it that supposedly marked one of the graves. Well, I don't see a cross there. I see an X. And I see these things often. They're surveyors' monuments. In the 1881 Surveyor General's reports says that at every section corner, you need to put a rock in with an X engraved on it. And at this location, Mayhew, the cadastral surveyor in 1891, actually, in his notes, he said, I put a boulder marked with a cross, and then he draws an X. So this can be a wonderful monument to the cadastral service, but I don't think it's from a grave, and I think it's misleading to suggest that it is. Now, I'm going to take you at the very end here, I'm going to take you on a little trip along the route that was taken by your ancestors. Because I think while I might be wrong, I'm probably not. And I think that over the coming year, my peers will be probably looking at what I've done and addressing the issues to say if the assumptions I have made and the interpretations that I've made about these features are correct. But I think, obviously, this raises a lot of issues for you as descendants. What are you going to do about these? Obviously, it raises bigger issues in terms of the landscape than you've ever had. We've always known where the attack site was, but the massacre sites have a real poignancy because the attack site is similar to lots of attacks and ambushes that occurred in the West. The massacre sites, there's a little treachery there, and the history is a lot more poignant. Now, let's see if we can do this, because I actually want you to see what we found. Okay, now what I'm going to do is we're going to fly over the route on that fateful day that was taken by the wagon train. So here we are. This is the modern monument. The ditch where they had built their embankment and where they had died was located right here. And this is where the bones were previously found. I believe that they were taken up this side of the creek, crossed at this old crossing here, came down and crossed across this field, which unfortunately had been plowed in the 30s. So if there was an old road there, it's no longer visible. Okay, here we go. So we're following up along here and crossing here. Now, other interpretations have the road going up here, but I don't believe it did. I think it cut straight across to the old California road. And while we're doing this, someone had asked about the elevation. We can do that. Here we go. So as you see, along this route, it goes up slowly, very slowly, until it hits right here is the rim of the basin. The rim of the basin is the point just before the two wagons were. And this is where the, that was basically where the wounded were. So you can see it looks like it's rising pretty quickly here, but this is an elevation rise of only about 200 feet. So it's a pretty, it's not a big distance.
Sir, can you point out where Highway 18 is?
Yes, I will. I'll go along here, and let me try this again, and then I'll stop. But this is 18 right here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm actually going to hide the road so you can actually see what's on the ground. Hopefully this will work. So here we cross Magatsu Creek. And we're crossing this field. We're headed toward the old California Trail. The road is gone. There's no evidence of it. It's been plowed. Except for here. We pick it up here. It runs up over this saddle. At this point here, it picks up the old California Trail. And you can see the California Trail, the main trail that they would have taken if they went on their route coming down this way, and it crosses over. Ignore this. This is a more recent road that's been bulldozed. Okay, now the militia was waiting right here. In here, you can see old scars left by the California Trail. So I assume this is where they came. This road is going down to a more recent gate. Evidence of the old road going around this. Now, if you'll notice that there are modern farm roads that seem to parallel where they would have gone. So these may actually be where the old roads were. Okay, now we're crossing some fields where you can't see the traces anymore because they've been graded. Okay, in here, this is possible a trace coming up here. You can see how straight this line of a creek is. Along here it extends quite a distance. Perfectly straight line. Old Spanish Trail, I believe. And we come up. Then in here we start to pick up a trace of the California Trail. Okay, right here is where the attack took place. This is where the bodies lay. Bodies were then put down in here. Here's our juniper tree. The women and children had already gone on ahead. These alignments of rocks were put there by Ezra Lytle in 1930 when he homesteaded this land. Okay, here we have the women's grave. These erosional events probably have occurred more recently. This was probably the head of this erosional here, and the closest place they could come to put in these graves. And you're probably wondering, why are these graves down in the ravine? Well, the reason I believe is it's the easiest way to bury a bunch of people. If you're in a ravine, imagine this, you cut out a notch with shovels, and then you build this structure, pile dirt around the edges, and 30 men could do all of that in a few hours. If you can imagine going up here and digging a hole and burying all these bodies and then putting a cairn on top, which I think is how most of us have imagined this, including myself. That could take days. That actually wouldn't be possible. The ground is very rocky here. So we go ahead. Here is where the attack took place, approximately. Not that many people there were doing the attacking, so we know a lot of the women and children tried to run away. They ran up this hill to the east, they ran up this hill to the north, and they ran up along the trail to where their grandfather was, lying in the wagon, probably right about here. And you can see this trail, the old Spanish trail, the California trail. To this day, you can follow this all the way up to Hamlin's Ranch. So, that is my story. And I guess the question now is what you want to do about it. And this is why I brought this to your group, so that the descendants might have a bigger say in what happens here than has happened in the past. I also know that wondering and worrying about where the remains of your ancestors are has been very stressful. And maybe if we can put this to rest somewhat by knowing where they are, knowing that they are protected, it might create a balm to heal some of these wounds. Thank you.
At this time, if anyone want to ask a few
I think
questions.
Scott's organizing
Okay.
something.
Okay. Lights.
Can you tell us where those areas are in relation to the two monuments that are there now?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right here. We'll just put this all right.
They're not close. And none of these graves are in the area set aside for the National Monument.
Are they on private land? Privately
Yes.
owned land?
Yes.
Yeah, a lot of, as this discussion goes forward, I can help you with what I found. Dr. Novak and Scott have been taking the lead on this, and so they're going to be able to be a lot more helpful than I am. But let me show you here, really quickly. Would you like the way I pass that off to you? Yeah, I can't show you here. I can show you maps afterwards. The men and boys monument is completely in the wrong location. It's on the east side of the valley. It's over 2,000 feet from where this other one that I found is. In addition, the historic records say the two were 350 yards apart. These are over 3,000 yards apart. Now, the monument for the women and children is actually fairly close. It's about 600 feet to the north. It's on the right road. It's in the right location. I think it's just a little bit further north. The two monuments, the two graves, and I actually call them tumuli. You may have seen that word. A tumulus is an archaeology term for a rock structure over graves. And, I didn't want to call it a tomb or a sepulcher or a cairn or a monument, so that's what I called them. But the location where the women and children were massacred is right in the middle of the highway to a certain extent. And so that raises certain interesting issues. I can show you maps, Judge, after if you like.
Any other questions? Rob?
Ground penetrating radar, was that any part of what you've done so far or not yet?
Yeah, I don't like it. It doesn't work. It works very, very well in certain circumstances. If the ground is too wet, if the ground is too dry, if the ground is too rocky, the ground is too clayey, it may not work. So it's one of these things where what I like to do when I use it is I will dig, and if I find something, I'll bring in the radar to see if it actually shows it, and then I know under those circumstances it works. The way it happened with the attack site. I think it was a new technology. People were really excited about it. I think perhaps too much trust was put in it that it would actually work at that location. It's like any tool, like my thing. You know, the best laid plans, you know, don't always work out, and sometimes you just need to go back to the old Indiana Jones way.
Your two sites are in between the two existing monuments?
Yes.
Do I have that right?
Yes.
Thank you.
Just so, go ahead.
Allow this question. What would it take to protect further erosion of the tumuli?
Not much. I think, are you familiar with the Turngavian baskets?
No.
They're just like little baskets made out of chicken wire or thing, and you fill them with rocks. I think a couple of those. It's not a big deal. I think whatever you did there, and Scott and Shannon have been thinking about this as well, you could cover up with dirt afterwards. So whatever you did would not be visible. I think that would be important. The erosion is an issue, but it's one that's easily fixed.
I think it's important to point out that whatever gets done there has to have the permission of the landowner. And again, these sites are located on private property, which are not currently included in the National Historic Landmark designation. We have had some discussions with the landowner, and we're hopeful that a good faith agreement or arrangement can be reached to ensure that we can protect these sites. There's been no testing other than just we've seen the sites, we've looked at the rocks, nothing has been disturbed, and there's been some concern by some of the other descendant groups I know that there's been absolutely no disturbance of those sites, and none is planned at this juncture.
So to the south, by quite a ways, there are some cinder cones, which is a huge source of that basaltic rock. So do you theorize that perhaps the Army guys had wagons and they went someplace and got the cinder and collected it to
No.
put there?
If you
Because
remember-
otherwise it's odd to have that the basaltic rock in that area, right?
No, not really. When those volcanoes went off, they blew rocks huge distances. And if you notice, all the rocks were rounded. So they had actually been collected from out of those drainages and other drainages. But if you had gone out in like a 500-foot radius, you could have gotten plenty of sandstone to build these. But the sandstone was all ignored. They went much further, probably not more than a mile, to get it.
But you wouldn't have to go to Bayo, if that's what you're thinking, the big cinder cones down in Bayo. You wouldn't have to go that far, but probably a wagon
Yes.
to haul it.
Can you guys use the microphone,
Oh, sure.
please? Because back here, you cannot hear.
We're sort of disorganized.
We're limited by cordage here. Robert Briggs, in the back, Robert Briggs asked about whether the basalt that was used to build the tumuli would have to have come from Bayo, which is quite some distance, where there are big cinder cones, big old volcanoes. And Everett responded, and I weighed in, that these volcanoes would have shot massive amounts of basalt further up. It's rounded. It's in the area, but not, if you walked across the field, you could get plenty of sandstone boulders to have done this, but they clearly went to some further distance and more selectively to gather those rocks up.
Do we have any other questions? Oh, not Phil.
I'll throw in one more.
Sure.
You mentioned mentioned that the location of the present monument was based to some degree on local folklore. What's the form of that record? Is it oral histories? Is it letters? How was that documented?
Yeah, I think Dr. Peichels could answer that better than me. The local farmers there, and China knows this as well, they've known for years that, or have been told, that these rocks were associated with the massacre. When they were kids, they weren't allowed to sit on them. And folklore is sometimes wrong. Lars?
Just to be clear, you don't mean these rocks, you mean rocks that are in the fields out there somewhere?
Yeah, he was referring to there are clusters of rocks up by where the Women and Children's Monument are. But they're actually up the hill a little further from where I think the road would have been. And at the Men and Boys Monument, there is a scatter of rocks, which is pretty obvious to me, the remains of a cairn that Gibbs identified in 1909, and he took Charles Kelly out there in the 30s, and they were convinced that's where the massacre took place. It's just past, it's like within a quarter of a mile of where the attack took place. It's totally wrong, but I'm sure it was in books and everything, and I'm sure the landowners believed it, and they passed that on to their kids and their grandkids, and that's how that story came about. That cairn appears to be really close to the northwest corner of Abe Burgess's homestead. So it's possible that it was actually a land monument rather than anything associated with the massacre.
These two that you have discovered, what does the landowners say about those? What is their...
The landowner was completely unaware that those rock piles on his property might be mass graves associated with the massacre. When we visited the site with him and walked down the old Spanish Trail, at first he told us he thought those were just rocks that had been cleared from the fields. We reviewed a report a draft report that Everett had been kind enough to share with us, and as we reviewed that with him and spent a couple hours with he and his wife, they agreed that there really was no other explanation for those rock piles except that they were mass graves.
I got a question. The bones that were dug up in 1999, now where was that location at?
Those were down at the Carlton Cairn, or the original siege site. In the process of constructing the new monument at the Carlton Cairn, those bones were inadvertently unearthed by a backhoe when they were digging the foundation for the new monument.
Yeah.
That's at the siege site.
Is that the what now?
Siege site.
Oh, see.
So in my report, what I was referring to the Emigrant Spring,
Yeah,
way down south, that's the same location.
okay.
Any other questions? Well, if not, I think we ought to have an auction. First, I'll please thank Everett Bassett for all his hard work on our behalf. There are refreshments in the back. Drink some, and Phil's going to sell you a bunch of junk you don't need.